In the last video, I introduced the rating system all-time college football programs. Just did a brief video, a brief overview of all that. I'm going to look in this one about how I use national championships to help with this rating system that I have. When I first started this, I thought this would be a fairly easy thing to do. It makes sense, right, to use national championships. All you have to do is go back in time to see who won national championships and add them up. Well, it's not that easy, as I quickly found out. When you go back in time, you realize, of course, most college fans know this, that there have been different ways of determining national champions in the past. I knew that, of course. I'm 55. I well remember all the years growing up as a kid, watching football games, watching the bowl games that helped determine a national champion. But if you go back far enough, even the bowl games didn't count. It was just a regular season. And if you go back even further, there were no polls. There were just schools playing each other in their own region for the most part. There wasn't any really a source that everybody accepted as authoritative if you go back before, say, 1936. Now, since then, 1936 being the year that the AP poll began, since that time, the NCAA, which itself only started in the late 30s, decided, I think in the 1950s, to try and go back and have a committee declare teams national champions all the way back to like 1869, the first year that college football game was played. I do not count those kinds of national champions because they're not contemporaneous. There's two criteria that I think are important. One, the source has to be authoritative. And of course, the NCAA is authoritative. It is the authority. And it also sanctions other entities like the AP poll to be an authority as well. But while it's authoritative, that committee I was talking about, it wasn't contemporaneous. That's the second part. So when you combine those two criteria, authoritative and contemporaneous, you really have to start with 1936 as being the year where national championships begin to be declared in an authoritative and contemporaneous way. That's the AP poll. And so that's where I ended up starting listing out the AP national champions until 1950 when the UP poll begins. Later on in the 50s, there's an INS poll for a few years before UP and INS merged to form UPI. They did the coaches poll for a long time, while AP did the sports writers poll, still do. So those polls were basically the authoritative contemporaneous sources of national champions up through 1964. And it was just for the regular season. No bowl games counted. In the 50s, there were also two other groups whom the NCAA recognized as being able to declare a national champion. The National Football Foundation was one, and the Football Writers Association of America was another. Those two declared national champions from the mid-20th century all the way up into the early 21st century before they merged and eventually stopped doing it with the BCS and playoff systems we have now. So those are two other sources of legitimate national champions that schools can claim. So in 1964, or 1965, I should say, the AP polls started to experiment with using bowl games to help determine national champions. They waited 2 more years after 65 in which they didn't do that. And then from 1968 on, the AP poll did. And then in 1974, the UPI poll started doing the same. So bowl games weren't even used to determine national champions up until the mid-60s to early 70s. And from that point, we go up to the late 90s before we begin to get into the BCS era and then eventually the playoff era, where it gets much simpler and much clearer. So if you go into this thinking that, X school declares 8 national championships or whatever, just, recognize that, keep that or take that number with a big grain of salt. What I do here, certainly not everybody will agree with this method I've used to determine the number of national championships, which I can show you on this tab. Uh, Championship years are the years that any particular school was declared a national champion or won a national championship on the field from one of these sources in the past, the polls or what have you. Winning it on the field is the easy thing to do. That's the straightforward, simple way that we now have. Even though the playoff system has problems, it is definitely better than the old polling system, which nobody ever really liked. But the polling system itself was an evolution from basically the nothing that had been there before. And through the polling era, as the bowl games were added into the equation, more and more different processes were put into place to try and make the bowl games a kind of semi-playoff system, which never worked completely well, but they got better at it as time passed until we finally just went to BCS. So you see the national championships here, the number of years, championship years. Championship number is just another number. I sometimes use a lot of these championships, like Alabama has 13, Notre Dame has 9, etc. You'll see asterisks by them. Those are sort of split championships of one kind or another. Another team was declared national champion by somebody during that year. And so it can get kind of confusing. And some of these championship years are a little bit iffy, to say the least. So what that championship number basically condenses out some of those iffier national championship claims from split years and that sort of thing. But I really, just to be as even-handed as possible, I just use the championship years, which are where I just count these years up. The schools get 10 points for each of those years to come up with that particular number that you see in the column here. So, and that's the biggest source of points in this rating system I have, because national championships really are what it's all about at the highest level of college football. That's what everybody wants to win. And that's what we all talk about all year long. Now, there are other parts to this. The postseason performance, I'll go into in the next video. That's mostly bowl games. But that, too, as I found out when I started doing this, became much more complicated as time went. And I kind of had to figure out a way of dealing with that. So I'll go over that in the next video. This stuff does get kind of confusing. So I'm trying to just give a brief going over. Leave comments if you like. If you're interested in this stuff, I like to talk back and forth with people, even argue up to a point. There is no one set way of looking at this. This is just my way of doing it. So if you want to leave a comment or a question or a critique, by all means do so. Thanks for listening.